Today's daf we're going to be learning is Kiddushin Lamed Chet, which is a very special daf because we are at the center point of our learning. So for all those who started from brachot, this is the middle daf, 1,335 dapim, and another 1,335 dapim to go, or that must be wrong, it must be 1336. By the way, I was thinking, I actually saw somewhere it's Lamed Tet and somewhere that it's Lamed Chet. I think it goes back to that sugya we saw about the psukim in the Torah. Is it part of the end of the first half, the beginning of the second half? It's actually kind of funny that whole discussion was close to, too bad it wasn't this stuff, but close to the center of the Shas. Okay, with that, we're going to get started. You have to remember also, this is the center, including shkalim. Okay, right? Shkalim was not isn't in the Bavli. It's only Yerushalmi. So anyway, but this is not exactly the center of the Bavli, just so you know. It's actually a few dapim earlier, maybe it is actually that daf. Okay, someone can go count and figure that out. So today we have a nice dedication, l'chavod, the middle of Shas. Today's daf is sponsored by Professor Jonathan Ben Ezra in honor of Dr. Robin Zeiger for completing half of Shas together today. To my better half, I'm looking forward to completing the other half of our journey together. Also, thank you to Rabbanit Moshe. Okay, with that, we'll get started. So we're in the middle of a very interesting topic of what we call mitzvot tluyot ba'aretz. Okay, that's what the Mishna called them, and that's why we call them this, although today we're going to see them termed something a little bit different. But we have mitzvot that are somehow dependent on the land. The way we defined it yesterday, it means if it's an obligation of the land versus if it's an obligation on the person, not connected to land at all. Okay, these things aren't exactly opposites because it could be on the person connected to the land. Those are going to be considered mitzvot tluyot ba'aretz. But that's how they came up with that definition, dependent on the land rather than the obligations on the person. And you would have to just add not dependent on the land. Shuli Mishkin wrote an excellent article in Flashback, which is good because I didn't really have time to address this in class. But it really begs to be mentioned, which is the famous opinion of the Ramban. Shuli wrote a whole article in Flashback about mostly the Ramban's approach to mitzvot tluyot ba'aretz and why he thought it was so important to live in Israel, because it's the only way to actually complete all the mitzvot. And he even almost suggests that that it could be you're not even really fully fulfilling mitzvot if you're doing them outside of Israel. Not to say anyone who's living outside of Israel is not fully completing mitzvot. But anyway, the Ramban is a very unique approach. And you can read her article all about it. Mostly it's centered on the Ramban himself, a little bit of history about him and about his approach and about how he himself lived his life and fulfilled his dream of making aliyah. Israel looked quite different in those days, and you can read about that too. So with that, we will get started with where we're in the middle of. I want to review a few things because we're going to also change a few things today or raise some issues with a few things. We started with a Mishna that has a few exceptions to the rule. There's mitzvot that are dependent on the land and yet also apply outside of Israel. What are those? We said Orla and kelaim, and Rabbi Elazar added also chadash, the new grains that are not allowed to be eaten until either, I'll already mention this, either the 16th of Nisan, and they bring the korban omer on that day. So as soon as the korban omer, the sacrifice of the omer, is brought, then you can eat the new grains. If you don't bring the sacrifice of the omer, for whatever reason they didn't bring that year, or you're living in a time when there's no temple, then chadash becomes permitted on the 17th. You have to wait the entire day out of the 16th, and only on the 17th can you start eating from the new crop. Now, what we said yesterday, if you recall, when we were trying to figure out if Rabbi Elazar was the vachomer or the kula, and was he adding it to which list was he adding of mitzvot that are only in Israel or even outside of Israel. And then when we brought that up, we mentioned that Orla and kelaim are hilchata gemirala, which means, we explained that to mean halakha l'Moshe Mishna. Today, we're going to see that that's not exactly true. Number one, it's not fully true that it means halakha l'Moshe Mishna. And we're going to see that Orla and kelaim are not really in the same category, that they're both learned out by halakha. But we're going to see that Orla is the one learned out by halakha and kelaim is actually learned out differently. Okay, we'll get to that, but that's going to kind of change a little bit what we saw yesterday in the Gemara's suggestion. Okay, where the Gemara seemed to suggest there was those two that were learned out halakha, we're going to see at the end of today's daf, based on the Mishna in Orla, that only Orla was learned out as a halakha, and then we're going to see two different definitions of what halakha means. Right, now we're going to move, and then how did we learn chadash, right? Chadash we learned, and this is where we're going to start today, from the fact that it says bechol moshvotechem. right? It says when you come to the land, it also said b'chomer shvotechem, and there was this big debate we saw yesterday. Is b'chomer shvotechem, does it mean everywhere, the way it kind of sounds, all your dwelling places? Or does b'chomer shvotechem mean specifically in Israel, okay? And specifically in Israel, when? After, why moshvotechem, where you dwell? Only after they dwelled, meaning after they conquered for 7 years and after they then inherited the land for 7 years, meaning at the end of those 14 years, that's when it clicks into place. So those were two different definitions of how to view the word moshvotechem in the Torah. So now the Gemara is going to say, if we have these two approaches, we're going to say one makes a lot more sense than the other in this context that we're going to see right now. 3 lines from the bottom of Lamed Zayin Amud Bet. It makes sense to say Moshav kol makom shatem yoshvim mashma, any place you live. Now, again, I want to just be very clear here. There's a connection between, if you say Moshav means once you conquered and settled, right? That relates to both time and place. What it means is it only starts to be in place year 15, right? The beginning of the 15th year after they got into the land. And number two, it's only going to be in Israel. If you say that it's not dependent on settling, then basically what you're saying is, if you hold by this approach, that Moshav means everywhere, okay? And it means all the time, even when they just got into the land, okay? Because if you say it has to do, Moshav means when you settle, then you're not obligated right when you get into the land. What I'm saying is there's two factors here. Number one, when did the obligation start? Did it start the moment they crossed the Jordan? Or did it start 15, right, in year 15? And if you say it started immediately, then that'll be synonymous with, well, then it applies everywhere, because if it doesn't depend on settling the land, then it doesn't depend either on location. That's the connection. So now they're going to say the following. If you're going to say that Moshav means anywhere you live, and that would mean the clock started ticking, the obligation began as soon as they got into the land, then that would explain the Omer and the forbid, right, chadash, this forbidden to eat new grains, and why they kept chadash, we're going to see, in the first year they got into the land. Then that makes perfect sense, because they kept it. We're going to see now from a pasuk in Yoshua that they did the mitzvah of chadash. They didn't eat the new grain until the 16th of Nisan. So that's going to prove that the obligation kicked in immediately. If it kicked in immediately, the Moshav is not dependent on settling. If it's not dependent on settling the land, because that would have been pushed off to year 15. If it's not dependent on that, then it's an obligation in all locations. So how do we know that? Because it says in Sefer Yoshua, okay, the year they got into the land, it says, the first year they did the Korban Pesach, then they ate from the produce of the land on the day after Pesach. So, sounds like they only ate the new grain after Pesach. They didn't eat the new grain before Pesach, meaning after the first day of Pesach. Why that day? Alma, it must be Ikruv Omer Bahadar Achil. They sacrificed the Korban Omer and then they ate it. And then they ate the new grains. Now, the way they view this pasuk is a halachic pasuk, right? It's telling us that they kept the halakha of chadash, which would then prove the chadash, if they kept the halakha of chadash when they first got into the land, as I've said already a few times today, that means the obligation kicks in immediately. That means it's not dependent on settling the land. That means moshvotechem can't mean settling. If it doesn't mean settling, then it must mean everywhere. Ela lamanda amal la'achar yerusha v'yeshiva. If you hold it was after they conquered and settled, then then they could have in that year eaten from the produce of the land immediately. So the Gemara answers, what are you talking about? This isn't a pasuk that's telling you halachically they didn't eat until the 16th. It's just a narrative pasuk telling you, by the way, when was the first produce they ate in the land? On the 16th of Nisan. Why? Not for halachic reasons, but for practical reasons, okay, or technical reasons. Let's hear why. Dichtiv. Well, they didn't need, okay, they didn't need to eat from the produce of the land until the 16th of Nisan because Uvnei Israel. Now, here we're going to go to Sefer Shmuel. When the Jewish people get the manna, remember they get out of Egypt and then they start complaining, they don't have food to eat, and then God brings them the manna. It says there in the pasuk, Uvnei Israel achlu et haman 40 shana ad bo'am el eretz noshavet, et haman achlu ad bo'am el k'tzei eretz Canaan. It's a very strange pasuk. It says, first of all, it's strange that in Shmot, we're already saying, until when are they going to be eating this man? That's interesting in and of itself, because we haven't even gotten there. But in any case, we're told, that's not what's going to be strange for us right now. They ate the man for 40 years until they came to the land of Israel, until they got to, and they ate the man until they came to the edge of Eretz Canaan. Now, those are two different things. They got to the edge of Eretz Canaan was when they were in Arvot Moab, before they crossed the Jordan. When they got into the land of Israel, that was later. It took some time to get from one place to the other. Those are two different dates. So if it's telling us they ate the man until this date, we have two different things. So the Gemara basically says you can't say it was until the edge of Eretz Canaan because it already says when they got into land. You can't say when they got into land because it already says till the edge of Eretz Canaan. So how could this possibly be? So now they're going to start with the chronology. This is really what happened. The 7th of Adar, Moshe dies. On the day of Moshe's death, pasak man milered. The man stopped falling. There was no man anymore. How do we have it both that they had the man until the edge of Eretz Canaan? Because that means when they were at the edge of Eretz Canaan, that's when the man, when they were at the edge before they got to Eretz Canaan, that's when the man stopped. And when they got into the land, that's when they kept eating the man until they got into the land. Okay, and this basically means that on Zayin Ba'adar, the man stopped falling. That's the first date. And then they continued, though, they kept the man until, okay, we're going to see exactly how many days, but they kept the man going until the 16th of Nisan. Okay, so we see that's from the 7th of Adar till the 16th of Nisan. So now, and yes, I saw that you're writing, which was the obvious question. Did we remember that the man gets destroyed immediately? Obviously, the man was a miraculous thing in general. And obviously, at this point, God made a miracle that until they got into the land, according to this midrash, they had food to keep them going. So this basically says the only reason why they ate chadash on the 16th of Nisan had nothing, it was a total coincidence, had nothing to do with the halakha of chadash, or at least it doesn't mean that they were obligated. Maybe God created it so that they wouldn't have to do it till, the 16th, so that they wouldn't eat the old crop, but not because they were obligated to not eat from the new crop, and it was forbidden. That prohibition only came into play 14 years later, okay, after they conquered and said. But this was just because they had food until then. They didn't need to eat from the food in the land until the 16th. They only came in, by the way, on the 10th. So it makes sense. It wasn't like there were so many days for them to have eaten until then. So now, once we start mentioning the man, and once we start mentioning the day of Moshe's death, we're now going to go first to braitot about the man. Then we're going to have a braitot about the date of Moshe's death and how we know he died on the 7th of Adar. And then we'll get back to our topic. So we're going off to the side right now. Tanya Idach, another braitot says, and this is based on, it's not just that we're talking about the man, but this idea that they ate the man for 40 years. And by the way, there's something in common with both these braitot. We'll talk about it after. Did they really eat for 40 years? Sorry, confusing my. Did they really eat for 40 days? They actually ate for 40 years minus a month. Why is this? Well, it says, and you can look at Rashi. Rashi quotes Chaser Shloshim. So first they got out of Egypt. Okay, we know they got out of Egypt on Yudala ben Nisan, right? That night they get out, and then they really tefav, and then they start eating. What they eat are the cakes they took out of Egypt. Okay, I don't think it was really cake, like chocolate cake or something. No, but they had, it was kind of some kind of dough they had. They ate that for a while, and then it says Vayisume Elim Vayavo Kol Adap Ben Yisrael Midbar Sina Asher Bein Elim Ubein Sinai b'Chamisha Yom L'Chodesh Hashini. The next thing we hear is that they get to this place on the 15th of the second month. That's Tevav B'Iyar. Now, Ktib Batrei, and then it starts saying, we used to have meat and blah, 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 and then, they end up getting the man. So here you have it. The pasuk says the man started on the 16th, the next day, right? So God says, I'm going to rain down man on you tomorrow. So the 16th of Iyar, the man starts. And when did it end? The 16th of Nisan. So now what do you see? We're missing a whole month. 40 years, we assume, now this is what's going to connect this with the next section, is we assume when it says 40 years, it means a complete 40 years, but it's missing a whole month. So how do you explain that? Well, the food they took out of Egypt, whatever you call these, okay, cakes, bread, something, ta'amu bahem ta'amman. They tasted like the man. What does this mean, right? Well, okay, first of all, man tastes like anything you wanted. I think what they're trying to say is that, again, God did a miracle. Just like God did a miracle by bringing the man, just like God did a miracle by letting that man that rained down on them on the last day, right before Moshe died, kept them going for another month plus. Likewise here, the food they took out of Egypt, God also made sure that kept them going for a long time. Okay, that's drasha number one. Drasha number two, Tanya Idach, another braitot. B'Shiva ba'Adar meit Moshe. B'Shiva ba'Adar nolad. Moshe died on the 7th of Adar, and he was also born on the 7th of Adar. Now you might say, why didn't they say it in the reverse order? Moshe was born and died on the same day. Well, you're going to see, because what they're going to do is they're going to learn the date of his death, and from there they're going to learn the date of his birth. So that's why it's said in that order. How do we know this? Shenemar. Now we're going to salute together a whole bunch of psukim, okay, both from Sefer Dvarim and from Sefer Yoshua, which makes sense. End of the Torah, beginning of Sefer Yoshua is all kind of one continuum. So we have Vayamat Moshe Eved Hashem. So Moshe dies, it says in the text, and then it says Uchtiv Vayivku b'nei Israel et Moshe ba'arvot Moav shloshim yom. This is all from the Torah. After Moshe died, they mourned for him for 30 days. Uchtiv, and now we're jumping to Sefer Yoshua, first chapter. It says Vayi acharei mot Moshe Eved Hashem. Uchtiv Moshe avdi meit va'ata kum avol. Right, so Yeshua is told Moshe died. Now you're supposed to go cross the Jordan. Now, obviously, they didn't cross the Jordan during the 30 days they were crying. The assumption is for 30 days they did nothing and just cried. Uchtiv, and then it says, then God tells Yoshua, go into the people, into the camp, tell the people in 3 days we're going to cross the Jordan. So we have the 30 days of people crying. Then we have 3 days of preparation. This seems similar, by the way, to preparation before they got the Torah, right? There were 3 days. So here also 3 days. And now we get a date. What's the date? They say the date is, when did they cross the Jordan? On the 10th of the first month. That means the 10th of Nisan. So now you have it. It was 33 days from the death of Moshe, 10th of Nisan, go back, right? And basically you have the 23 days from Zayin Adar till the end of the month, 23 days of Adar. And then you have 10 days of Nisan, and that's going to get you to 33 days. So from there you have that Moshe must have died on the Zayin Adar. So go back 33 days. And there you get that Moshe died on that day. So that's the chronology. Now, how do we know what day Moshe was born? When Moshe is about to die, he says to them, I am 120 years old today. Now, why does he say today? He could just say, I'm 120 years old. Why do you have to say today? Then I can no longer help, go out and come back. I can't be your leader anymore. You don't need hayom. From here you see that God has tzaddikim complete their days. This is the connection to the previous. We wanted to complete that 40 years and assume it was a complete 40 years. Likewise, we want to complete Moshe's days and say he actually lived complete 120 years. And how do we know this? It's learn from a different pasuk. This is in Sefer Shmot, chapter 23, when it talks about God saying, I'm going to send an angel out to guide you on your way. And then it says there, actually, kind of like if you do good things, it says, there won't be bad things in your land, and mispar yamecha amalei will complete your days. And they learn this to be referring dafka to tzaddikim, to righteous people, that their days are complete. By the way, this reminds me of that joke they always say, what do you say to someone on their 120th birthday? You say, have a good day, right? So it's like this idea that 120 to the day, that's exactly when he died. Okay, so we've resolved. Okay, this was all an aside, and now we're going to get back to our topic. So just let's review the daf until this point, and then we'll move on. We started with continuation of this discussion. Does moshav, when it says moshav in the Torah, does it mean settling, inheriting, and settling, which would mean it only kicks into play? It would mean, number one, it only kicks into obligation on after the 14 years of conquering and settling. Number two, it would mean it's only in Israel. And we just proved, or we tried to prove from Yoshua, the fact that they kept chadash the first year and when they got into the land right away, they were careful not to eat the new grain before the 16th. They only ate it on the 16th, would show that moshav actually doesn't mean you have to wait till you settle land, and then therefore it doesn't mean it's only in Israel. And it means it kicked into play right away, and it's therefore going to be all in every place. But that proof was rejected, or the fact that they were trying to reject the other shita was knocked out, because in the end they say it was actually technical. They had the manna until then, and therefore they had no issue. They didn't need to eat, and that was why they didn't eat it until then. And then we talked about the 40 years, how we got to full complete 40 years, and then we got to how do we know, since it mentioned that Moshe died on Zayin Adar, how do we know that Moshe died and was born on the 7th of Adar? Now we're going to go back and we're going to bring a one braita with two different opinions. The two different opinions, one is Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, very famous, and the second is his famous son, Rabbi Elazar. And they're both going to have very different approaches to this issue of the three exceptions to the rule that we've been discussing. So we keep going back to Orla, kelaim, and chadash, even though in our Mishna they were kind of separated, Orla, kelaim, and then chadash was a machloket. Now we're going to really say it's Orla, kelaim, and chadash are a unit, and let's talk about them. So now we're going to see a big debate between Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai and his son about this topic. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai omer, Shalosh mitzvot nitzvu Yisrael b'knisatan la'aretz, v'nohagot bein ba'aretz bein b'chutz la'aretz. He says there's three mitzvot that they were commanded only when they got into the land, and yet they're obligated. Okay, this is what we've been saying all along, and yet they're obligated both in Israel and outside of Israel, and that's our three mitzvot. But his source for them is going to be different. Until now, what did we see? Moshav is learned from the chadash is learned from Moshav in the Torah, and kelaim and Orla, we said before, and this is why I reviewed at the beginning of the daf, was hilchat hagemirala, which we understood to mean halakha l'Moshe Sinai, which usually we place somewhere in between derived and derived. Usually we have Torah law and rabbinic law. Halakha l'Moshe Sinai is a very strong rabbinic law, okay, almost close to Torah law. So now Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai is going to say something different. So he says, "Hu adin sheyinhagu," and it's actually logical. This is another way of saying it's a vachomer, that these things we're going to learn by vachomer, that these mitzvot exist, that there are obligations also outside of Israel. How so? Well, ma chadash. Okay, he starts with the premise. He agrees with what we said before. The chadash comes from the Torah because it says vachomer shvotechem, even though it says kitavo when you get to the land, it also says vachomer shvotechem, which means everywhere you live, which means Israel outside of Israel, and therefore that's a given. Now we're going to say from chadash we can learn to Orla and kelaim. Okay, as opposed to yesterday where they were saying it was obvious Orla and kelaim because that's halakha Moshe Sinai, but we have to figure out chadash, and is Rabbi Elazar really saying that's forbidden, or, that that's an obligation outside of Israel? So now we're starting the reverse. That's the one that's obvious. Now, why is it obvious to him? Because he obviously understands Moshav as meaning everywhere you live. That was his approach, like we saw approaches yesterday. Now, he's going to say the following. Let's define chadash and show that it's a very weak prohibition, and yet it's going to apply outside of Israel as well. Therefore, prohibitions that are stronger, i.e. kelaim and Orla, are going to be forbidden as well outside of Israel, right? It's going to apply outside of Israel because they're stronger prohibitions. So if the weaker prohibition is even outside of Israel, then obviously the stronger prohibitions are going to be outside of Israel as well. So let's see his logic. Chadash is going to have three things that make it, so to speak, weaker, not a very strong prohibition. Number one, ein isuro isur olam. Well, the new produce is not forbidden forever. It's only forbidden until, if you don't do anything, it's forbidden until the 17th of Nisan. It's not forbidden to benefit from. I could give it to my animals to eat, by the way, before I bring the korban omer, or before the 17th of Nisan comes. I give it to my animals; they can benefit from. And not only can I wait till the 17th and then eat it, but I actually can do an action to permit it, which is bringing the sacrifice of the Omer on the 16th, and immediately I can be permitted to eat the new grains even on the 16th. So it has three factors about it that make it weaker, so to speak. And yet, right, even though noheg bein ba'aretz bein b'chutz la'aretz, and yet it applies in Israel and outside of Israel. Therefore, kelaim, so these, if you plant grapevines next to your crops and they grow together, your grains, let's say, kelaim shisuro isur olam. First of all, that will never be permitted, whatever grew there. Isuran isur hana'ah. It's also forbidden to benefit from kelaim. And ein heter lisuran, and there's no way to permit it. Well, if this is more strict, then obviously it should apply across the board. And Orla in two of these ways. There's a bit of a debate, which two ways, because Orla also, once it grows, right, fruits from the tree on the first, second, and third year are never permitted. So any isur, right, isuran is isur olam. They're forbidden b'hana'ah, and there's no heter to them. But Rashi explains that really, and some people complain about this because it's not exactly true, there is they are permitted. When are they permitted? In year 4. Now, it's a little tricky. Perot Orla, normally we say anything that grew in year 1, 2, and 3. Anything that grew in year 1, 2, and 3 won't be permitted in year 4. But the tree itself, whatever grows from it in year 4, will eventually be permitted. So in a sense, it's a little bit lighter than the other, but at least in two ways, it has the same as it's more strict than chadash. So that's Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. So again, he doesn't learn the halakha Moshe Sinai. He says, first we learn chadash from the Torah, from there vachomer to the other two. Comes his son and entirely disagrees with everything we've seen till now. Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon, turning now to Amud. Kol mitzvot shenitztavu Yisrael kodem knisatan la'aretz. Now notice the language. The language is a little different. It's not mitzvot to the ha'aretz, and Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai used the same language. He called it mitzvot that we were commanded for when we got into the land. Okay, so he says any mitzvah that we were commanded before we got into the land. Okay, noheget bein ba'aretz bein b'chutz la'aretz, meaning that it would click into play before we, and maybe you could call it before we settled the land, right? Meaning it's another way of kind of saying dependent on the land, but he does use a little bit of a different language. And we'll see that language is going to be important as we go on. But it really seems like it's meaning one and the same thing. So all these mitzvot were commanded before we got into the land, which means they're not really connected to the land. So this is going to be applicable in the land or outside the land. But la'achar nisatan la'aretz, all the things that we were commanded that only click into play after we got into the land, eina noheget ela ba'aretz. Okay, only in Israel. Chutz means, pay close attention. He's not going to say Orla. He's not going to say kelaim, and he's not going to say chadash. He doesn't think that those are exceptions to the rule. He thinks that those apply only in Israel. Okay, so he has a totally different approach, and he removes two others. Which one does he remove? Two that we haven't heard of at all yet. Hashmatat ksafim v'shiluach havadim. Two things that are actually kind of similar in nature, which is cancellation of loans in the shmita year and sending out slaves to go free in the Jubilee year. Now, these are two things that are what we call the equalizers, right? We want to try to make everybody equal. So anyone who was sold into slavery because they didn't have money gets to go free. Anyone who had a loan gets to be free from the loan. And then again, they don't have to pay their money. It helps the poor to kind of even up a little bit with the wealthier. So now, those two things, even though we were commanded to do them after we got into the land, meaning, in other words, they're connected to the land. Now, here's going to be the tricky part. They're not really connected to the land, right? Cancellation of loans and freeing slaves are not things that are obligations of the land. Anyway, we'll get to that in a minute. So those two are exceptions to the rule that even though we were commanded to do them after we got into the land, which we think means kind of, and are connected to the land, yet we're obligated to do them even outside the land of Israel. So now we have two totally different exceptions, and he doesn't agree with the exceptions of what we've been talking about until now. To which the Gemara is now going to ask on each of these individually, but wait, if our whole categorization is based on what we've been defining it as, mitzvot tzliot ba'aretz have to do with an obligation of the land and not an obligation on the person not connected to the land, well, these aren't even in that category. In other words, Rabbi Elazar assumes two things. Number one, that those two things would belong in the category of things that we were only commanded once we got into the land, i.e., what they assume this means, i.e., they mean dependent on the land, right? And are obligations of the land. And number two, that they're exceptions, that they're obligated even outside of Israel. So despite the fact that that categorization normally is only in Israel. So the first question is, Hashmata Ksafim Chobat Gufi. But Shmita Ksafim is an obligation on the person, has nothing to do with the land. So why did you even, we understand the exception to the rule, we don't disagree about that, but why would you say it's an exception to the rule? And that's, we agree with you that it's outside of Israel, but why did you even put it in that category and have to say it's an exception to that category? It's not even in that category. To which they say, Lo nitzracha ela l'chidetani. Well, we need it because of this braitot. He needed, or he believed it was part of that categorization because of the following drasha. Before we read the drasha, let's read the pasuk, the whole pasuk. It's in Dvarim Tetvav. It says, V'zeh dvar hashmita shamot. This is the laws of shmita, shamot, which is a verb that comes from shmita, okay, which means things are stopped. Okay, we're going to obviously, or maybe not obviously, but I know obviously because I read the Gemara, which is we're going to talk about the double language here, shmita, shamot, why you have to have that word twice. Kol ba'al mashe yado asher yashe b're'ehu, anyone who has an obligation, right, a legal, he owes money to a friend, lo yigos et re'ehu, and as if I loaned you money, you owe me money, I can't collect it back. Ve'et achiv, okay, re'ehu ve'et achiv, his brother or his friend, ki kara shmita la'Hashem, because this year was called shmita to God. Now, what they're going to, and the end do, is that shmita shamot, we're going to have a drashan, and then we're going to say, ki kara shmita la'Hashem seems to be expansive somehow. It's a more general phrase. So first they're going to say, why do we need to say that shmita ksafim is, now again, remember his language. It didn't say it's an obligation on the land. He said, nitztavu Yisrael achar knisatan la'aretz. It's part of the category of commandments that we're only commanded once we get into the land, which really means not once we get into the land, but once we conquer and settle the land after the 14 years. And then that always is equated with obligation only in Israel then. Titania, Rabbi Yomi. Rabbi says, "V'zeh dvar hashmita shamot," double language. So what do we learn from this? B'shtei shmitot hakatuv medaber. You might remember this. We had this in Gittin when we were learning about prusbal and all that. There's two shmitot in this pasuk mentioned. This is a reference to two different kinds of shmitot. Echad shmitat karka. One is not working the land, and most people understand. We learned this in Gittin that means actually Jubilee year. Okay, where we also don't work the land, the Jubilee year, and echad shmitat ksafim. And one is shmita on the money, which is every 7 years. Bizman she'ata meshamet karka, ata meshamet ksafim. When the Jubilee year land a commandment applies to the land, that's when this issue of the loans being canceled. Bizman she'ata meshamet karka, ata meshamet ksafim. But when you don't have either shmita or yovel, okay, on the land, then you also don't have shmita ksafim, which basically means, in other words, this fits into the category of we were not commanded until we got into the land and settled it, because Shemitah and Yovel didn't start till after the 14 years, till they settled the land. And therefore, Shemitah of Ksafim, this cancellation of loans, didn't apply until then. So that's why it belongs in the category of mitzvot, right? Again, we'll read how he says it. Shenitztevu alehem la'achar knisatan la'aretz, that they were only commanded to do once they got in and actually settled the land. Now, if that's the case, that we just compared Shmitat Ksafim to Shmitat Karka in terms of time when the obligation kicks in, well then, Ema bimkom she'atam shemek karka tam shemek ksafim ubemakom she'ena tam shemek karka ena tam shemek ksafim. Well, if we have this comparison of the two, then we should take it across the board. It's not just when does the obligation kick in, it should also apply to where the obligation kicks in. And if Shemitah is only relevant in the land of Israel, which is clear, or Jubilee year is only relevant to the land of Israel, which is clear, then Shmitat Ksafim, the cancellation of loans, should also only apply in Israel and not outside of Israel. So why did Rabbi Elazar, if already this drasha says we're going to compare them in terms of when does the obligation start, question of when, it should also be answer the question of where, and where should be only in Israel. So how did we get to, in other words, basically they're asking, we get why you put it in that category, But then why is it an exception to the rule in terms of location? So the answer is, because Talmud Lamal ki kara shmita l'Hashem mikol makom. Because it says, right, the loans are canceled because God, right, this is a shmita to God, which would sound like this applies everywhere and anywhere. And that's how we get to. So shmita shamot is about the time, when does the obligation kick in, which is why we put it in this category, but it's an exception to the rule because of the end of that verse, which seems to be adding something general that this applies everywhere. So again, I said it very clearly that there's one issue is when the obligation kicks in, and the other obligation is where is the obligation? Once it kicks in, where is the obligation? So that explained the first part of why Shmita Ksafim is part of this category and yet an exception to the rule. Now we have to do the exact same thing with Shiloh Chavadim. Shiloh Chavadim, Chovat HaGufu. Again, it's not an obligation connected to the land, it's an obligation to free your slaves. So Shiloh Chavadim is an obligation on the master. It has nothing to do with the land. Well, you might have thought, now we're going to go to the pasuk in Yovel. I'm going to read from the beginning. This is Vayikra Kafhe 25, chapter 25, verse 10. You should sanctify the 50th year. And you should call out freedom in the land. Notice in the land. Okay. For all its inhabitants. Yovel hi tielachem. This is the Jubilee year, should be for you. Okay, I'll stop here. We don't, okay, well then it just says, and everyone goes back to their, right, Shavtem, Isha l'chuzatov, Isha l'shvachtot tashuvu, which is the land goes back to its previous owners and the slaves go back to their, right, they get freed. So now they say, you might have thought, Ho'il uktiv ukratem dror ba'aretz, ba'aretz im b'chutz la'aretz lo. Talmud lamar, yovel hi mikol makom. So then they say, what's the whole issue? Why does he have to say it's an exception? Well, because you might have thought that this was connected to the land, because it says, and you call out freedom in the land, which sounds like the land is always, haaretz is always a reference to the land of Israel. And therefore, you might have thought maybe this doesn't apply abroad. How do we know it applies abroad? Yovel hi, because that's again a general term. This is the Jubilee year. This is Jubilee year everywhere. So now they're going to say, im kematam lover ba'aretz. So what is ba'aretz doing there? This is a bit of a different structure than the previous one, but in the end, we're getting to the same thing, which is, why is this in the category of things that are only commanded when we got into the land? And why does it anyway apply outside of Israel? Bisman sha'adror noheg ba'aretz, noheg b'chutz la'aretz. Ein dror noheg ba'aretz, eino noheg b'chutz la'aretz. So now they said, so why does it say ba'aretz, the land, if it's not dependent on the land? And the answer is very simple. It's exactly what we said before, that relates to the time frame. When you're obligated in the land, i.e., after the first 7 years and the next 7 years, right? In other words, number one, there's a starting date, which is only year 15 after you conquer the land, which means that's going to put freeing the slaves in the category of they weren't commanded right when they got into land, only right later, that only once they settled the land, they're obligated. They weren't obligated before they got in the land. So when the Jubilee year is happening, that's when you're going to have this mitzvah everywhere. Again, Aretz refers to time, and Yovel Hi refers to location, that it's everywhere. Okay, and that's how we get our exception. By the way, there's two issues here. Number one is, when did it kick into play, the Jubilee year? And this is true also by the Shmita Ksafim, assuming Shmita Karka means Jubilee year. The Jubilee year is no longer. Why is it no longer? Because the majority of the Jews are no longer in Israel. This, by the way, someone put in a WhatsApp group this week about that 46% of the Jewish population, or maybe even 46 point something, is already in Israel now. And that's like a whole big switch. And we're getting toward 50%. Question is, what happens when we hit 50%? Do all these things go back in? What will happen? But for many, many years, we haven't had a Jewish majority in Israel. And because of that, Jubilee years have not been practiced anymore. So there's no longer then, right? These are dependent. That's why we don't have slaves anymore, but you wouldn't free slaves anyway now because it's no longer relevant. But the point is, again, both these mitzvot, we separate between time and location. Time, the obligation kicks in exactly the same as things that are dependent on the land. However, there are exceptions to the rule in terms of location, because there's in each of them, they have something general, which would then say, now that this is general, so we're now going to include other locations as well. So that's Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. We have a Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon. We have a big debate between Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai and his son Rabbi Elazar. Which are the exceptions to the rule? Is it Orla, kelaim, and chadash, which is what we've seen until now, everybody said, and Rabbi Elazar is this unique shita, that those actually only apply in Israel. And the two that are exceptions are these two. Now, let's go back. We're now going to go to a Mishna in Orla, and we're going to go back and explain. If you remember, we had two explanations so far for the sources. Everyone agrees, and this is going to continue. Chadash, we learned from the Torah, from Moshe Votechem. If you're going to say Chadash as an exception, it's all locations. It's because you're going to understand Moshe Votechem to mean everywhere. Again, that's a source of debate. But if you're going to say the chadash is everywhere, then you're going to have to hold that way, and it's going to come from the Torah. Orla, we said, Orla and kelaim, we had two ways to explain so far. One was they're both halakha Moshe Sinai, which was kind of, the Gemara just mentioned that like in passing. And the other, which by the way, the commentaries there say, they didn't really mean Orla and kelaim is a halakha Moshe Sinai based on our Gemara today, which we're going to see right now, that only Orla is halakha Moshe Sinai, and they really meant Orla. They didn't really mean kelaim. So it's not like it's another approach. It's, they kind of say, oh yeah, that really didn't mean what they said. They didn't really mean what they said. They just kind of clumped them together, but really it was Orla as halakha. And then we saw before Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who said it's a vachomer. Once you have chadash, you can learn Orla and kelaim from a vachomer argument. Now we're going to bring a Mishna in Orla. HaChadash asur min haTorah b'chol makom. Orla halakha va'kelaim midivrei sofrim. We now have a categorization, which the simple reading is chadash, Torah. Orla is halakha, which we're going to assume right now means halakha l'Moshe Sinai. And kelaim, we learn out from the rabbis. Okay, so this is classic, right? Usually we have derived, Rabbanit, right? Rabbinic or Torah law. Derived is Torah law. Rabbanit is rabbinic law. In the middle, you have halakha l'Moshe Sinai, which is a very strong oral tradition. So it's somewhere in between derived and Rabbanit, and that's the levels here. Hadash is outside of Israel. We know this because of the Torah law, Moshe Votechem. Then we get weaker. We get Orla, which is halakha Moshe Sinai only. And then you get even less, which is kelaim is midivrei sofrim. That's the way we're going to understand this right now. But in a second, we're going to say maybe not. My halakha. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel, hilchita medina. Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel, halakha means this was the general practice, meaning it was a custom that the people made up. Okay, meaning people decided to start keeping Orla outside of Israel, but based on nothing, I wouldn't like to say nothing, but customs develop in all sorts of ways, right? We just mentioned recently the custom that women insist on, that view it as an obligation of Tkiyat Shofar, even though they're clearly not obligated. It says in the Gemara, there's no obligation, but women took it upon themselves as if it was an obligation. So likewise here, Orla didn't come from nowhere, right? Orla wasn't supposed to be outside of Israel, but people decided to keep that mitzvah outside of Israel for whatever reason. But it's just a minhag, which means it's much weaker, right? It doesn't go 1, 2, 3, it goes 1, 3, 2, right? Torah, minhag, custom, and then rabbinic law. So then the order doesn't make as much sense, but that's not why we're going to question Rabbi Yehuda, but we will find a question on him in a minute, okay? So that's his approach. Ulla Amar, so Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Shmuel. Ulla Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Ulla says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, halakha l'Moshe Sinai. He says what we thought originally. So comes Ulla now, and is going to question Rabbi Yehuda. Amar Ulla. So we have two generations. We have Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan, and then we have their students who pass down their words, and now their students are arguing. Ulla says to Rabbi Yehuda, now he's going to say, mine makes perfect sense with the Mishnah you quoted in Orla. The beginning of that Mishnah, we're going to read right now, sets up that Orla is stricter outside of Israel than kelaim. Now, if Orla is stricter, you can't say Orla was a custom and kelaim was rabbinic. It would have to be the opposite, because we're going to see the law is stricter by Orla, which means it makes sense to say Orla is halakha l'Moshe Sinai and kelaim is underneath because it's only midrabbanan, okay, only by rabbinic law. So that's basically the point. So let's read the Mishnah and understand it, and then that will be our question, and we'll be left with our question for today. Bishlam al-Didi, who says halakha l'Moshe Sinai, hainu deshane le ben safek Orla l'safek kelaim. When you get into a situation where you're not sure if something's Orla, okay, you see some fruits, maybe they're Orla, maybe they're not. You think they came from some field, you're not sure, you have no idea where they came from, or you have reason maybe to believe it, you have no real reason to know that these were Orla or not, or these were kelaim. They were mixed breeds, stuff planted together. Well, the fact is, the premise of this Mishnah is, even though Orla and kelaim are outside of Israel, when you're really outside of Israel, safek is permitted, okay? There's no laws of safek Orla. It's only what's clear by Torah law, right? Safek d'oraita l'chumra, safek d'Rabbanan. I'm sorry, safek d'oraita l'chumra. We have a safek about Torah law, we're going to be strict. When you have a safek about rabbinic law, we're going to be lenient. So therefore, outside of Israel, there is no law of safek Orla or safek kelaim. So now, but we're going to see a minor difference. It's going to show that Orla is more strict, which is going to be Rav Ulla's question against Rav Yehuda. Ditna. Safek Orla. Ba'aretz asur. Okay, since it's Torah law. In the land of Israel, you're not sure, it's forbidden. Besuria mutal, if you're in Syria, which is near Israel, and it was conquered by David, but this source obviously holds, this Mishna holds, kibush yachid lo shmei kibush. This isn't considered part of really the borders of Israel for laws of things that are dependent on the land, so your safek will be permitted. If you go as far as chutz la'aretz, though, we're going to be even more lenient. In other words, Syria at least is close to Israel, so we don't want people to confuse and see people doing that in Syria and think you can do that in Israel. But in chutz la'aretz, when you're farther away, we can even permit the following. Yored v'lokach. You can even go into a field of a Gentile that you know has Orla and you know he has non-Orla. And what can you do? You can purchase from him, not knowing where they came from. Let's say the left-hand side of his field is Orla and the right-hand side of his field is not Orla. So you can go and buy from him, even though you know that there's a chance that he's selling you Orla, as long as you didn't see him pick it from the side that has Orla. If you saw him pick it from the side that has Orla, that's a problem. That's where we draw the line. What we're going to see is the line is drawn by kelaim differently. And that's where we're going to see that kelaim is more lenient than Orla. And with that, we'll finish for today. And in that same Mishna by kelaim, it says, if you have a vineyard where they planted also grains right nearby, and then they grew together, the yerek nimkar chutzala, and then there's a vegetable stand right outside, and they're selling their stuff on the street. Ba'aretz asur, if this was in the land of Israel, you can't do it because you don't know. Maybe he's selling you the kelaim stuff. Besuria mutal, in Syria, this is permitted because it's only safek. And bechutz la'aretz, but if you're really far, you can even yoreh v'lokate. Forget about buying in their stand right outside their property, but which you really don't know where it came from. Maybe they even got it from a different field. That's really safek. But in chutz la'aretz, you can even do more. You can go into the field and you can pick u'bavad shelo yokot b'yad. Okay, you can pick, but you can't take it by hand. Okay, so now what does it mean locate exactly? And some people say it actually is not yokot, but you can, like, he can pick it and you can watch him pick it. It seems like maybe the Gentile can pick it. You can watch him pick it from the kelaim, and yet you still are allowed to, even though you saw it, you still are allowed to as long as you don't do it yourself. So you see here, the kelaim is treated more leniently than Orla, which is Ulla's question. It doesn't make any sense. If we're going to treat it more leniently than Orla, then it must be that Orla is stricter. That means that Orla can't just be a custom that it's outside of Israel. It must be more serious, like halakha Moshe Sinai. Okay, and then we're going to say, right, well, we'll continue the question tomorrow, but basically the question is quite obvious. Okay, so now we're going to stop here. And again, review just very quickly from the second part of the daf. We saw Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai and his son and their argument about which are in and which are out, and that his son clearly disagrees with the three exceptions that we've been holding as obvious. Then we go back to and then we had to explain why he even puts the shmita ksafim and the freeing of the slaves into the category of mitzvot tliyot ba'aretz, what we usually call it, even though they're not really dependent on the land. And why they're exceptions, then once we do put them in that category. And then we went to this Mishna in Orla, which basically described the different levels and how each one was learned. We had a big debate about what halakha means, two sides, and then we brought the beginning part of that Mishna to basically try to knock out one of the sides. Okay, Ulla brought us a question for the person who disagreed with him. With that, we'll finish our daf today, wishing everybody a great day.